You know, I think it was my boy Kanye that once said, 18 years, 18 years. Terraria's been around for like pretty close to 18 years. I mean, 12 is pretty close to 18, I think. He truly is the GOAT. And while to some of my audience, 12 years might only be a small portion of your life, to most, Terraria's been around ever since you could remember anything. But I've noticed something about this game that not too many others can replicate. It just never seems to die. Even its biggest online comparison, Minecraft, has had massive down points in its lifetime, but Terraria has always maintained some sort of relevancy no matter how long it takes for an update. Now, granted, Terraria has a much smaller but more dedicated fan base, so comparing it to Minecraft isn't really an equal battle. And don't even get me started on the developers. Obviously, part of them not wanting to give up the game is simply the fact that the fanbase is growing stronger and faster than ever, but it just feels like Relogic can't move on from this title, and if they did, I highly doubt they would ever find the same success that they did with Terraria. I would love to be proven wrong on that though. I genuinely do think this team has so much potential for future titles. But anyways, this had me asking myself, will Terraria ever actually die? Obviously, it'll eventually stop getting support from the developers, but will that just be the end? Or will this game continue to live on for generations to come? Keep in mind that everything I say in this video is speculation and hypothetical scenarios, but I think it would still be interesting to take a glimpse into Terraria's future. Also, just because these theories are separated into different segments of the video doesn't mean that only one can happen. The death of a game is due to many aspects, and odds are it's not just going to be one of these causes that result in Terraria's potential downfall. So let's get theorizing, starting with the more probable and slowly getting a little more far-fetched, but also a little more fun as we go. And then at the end of the video, I'm going to try to calculate a legit answer for the question based on real statistics and probability. Obviously, the first and most likely contributor to Terraria's downfall would be a slow but steady decline. Although currently it just seems like they can't stop producing new content, Relogic will one day stop supporting this game, and after that final update, you've pretty much sealed a game's fate. Now, obviously, the game isn't going to be completely dead, there's always going to be players of any game. But odds are, after that final update, Terraria will never see the same success that it has in recent times.
50,000 people used to live here. Now it's a ghost town.
Or I could be completely wrong. Maybe the fanbase will find new and innovative ways to keep the game alive through either mods or methods that we don't know about yet. The problem with a game like Terraria is that although it is a sandbox, the replay value of it is still limited. This game is very heavily focused on boss progression, and after you fight the same bosses over and over again, it just isn't worth it to play at some point. And since there's always new titles coming out, it's basically inevitable that the game will either get outshined or forgotten due to new games, which is actually my next theory. Indie development is weird because although most games made by small groups or solo devs are quickly forgotten or never even recognized in the first place, there's always going to be a select few that take the industry to the next level. Terraria was one of those games when it came out, but that doesn't mean that there won't be more in the future. The gaming industry is always evolving, and eventually there will be one or two groundbreaking games that could knock Terraria out of the top 10. Now, do I say this is going to happen instantly? Obviously not. Games as legendary as Terraria are very hard to come by, but it's practically inevitable for this to happen. The reason I think this one is so likely is due to the fact that Terraria is very much a retro-style game, and although there's always going to be a market for that, I'm not so sure that the newer generations of players are going to appreciate it the same way that older players do.
Screw this, I am going to watch Skibidi Toilet.
And just like video game players are evolving with the industry is also evolving with the players. And I'll tell you what, it is not an easy fight for the industry. Due to the recent rise in demand for short-form content and decrease in attention spans, some older video games just aren't as entertaining to new players. And if we keep going down this path of smaller attention spans and more requirements to be entertained, Terraria can simply become too boring for anyone to play. Obviously, this would take a long time to happen, but I'm not going to call it impossible. The biggest contributor to this problem I can think of is VR. Obviously, we all know that Terraria is a 2D game, but if VR eventually becomes a standard for gaming, on top of the lack of attention spans, Terraria most likely won't make it to the other side. Unless they made a 3D version, obviously. You should totally go watch this video. Once again, let me clarify. There will always still be players of the game, but it would definitely be harder for it to draw a new audience. But even if Terraria was to draw a new audience, it's also possible that in the future, things that are normal currently will be incredibly offensive. Yeah, this one's a little more far-fetched, but it's still a possibility that Terraria might just get straight up cancelled for some of its content. Now, obviously, this game isn't directly offensive to any group or specific person that I can think of, but cancel culture definitely has its ways of twisting things. So let's take a couple examples of really stupid ways Terraria could get cancelled. The zoologist is a very NPC, but it's possible that she could be viewed as a sexualization of a furry. I know, terrifying. Or what about the fact that you can drink and drive? Or maybe PETA will take legal action against Terraria for allowing you to recklessly slaughter animals. Obviously, these are all stupid and highly improbable scenarios, but there is one more way the game could get canceled that is a little more likely, and that way is politically. We all remember when Donald Trump reopened a case about banning children from playing violent video games, right? I'm pretty sure that law would also affect Terraria and would definitely knock out a pretty big chunk of the fan base. If just one more president comes into office and the government decides to actually follow through with the law, gaming as we know it could be changed forever, including Terraria and its community. Because let's face it, Terraria might as well be a kid's game with how many underages are playing it. Now, I know this video has been pretty pessimistic, so before I try to calculate Terraria's death day, I want to reward you for making it through all that negativity and present to you my final theory. Terraria will never die. Now, some of you might be a little confused as to how that would even work, because I mean, eventually a game has to die, there's no avoiding it. Like, when was the last time you thought about Splitgate? Well, let me ask you this. When I say Super Mario Bros. For the NES 1-1, this image comes to your mind, correct? Perhaps Terraria is such a legendary game that people will simply know what it is whether they've played it or not. Even if the game doesn't maintain the same amount of fans, it's completely possible that it will still always be remembered as a legendary game of its time. It's hard to say whether a game this massive can actually be forgotten about because we simply aren't living in a time where we can forget about it yet. But I do have hope that this fanbase will live on at least until the 2200s. Maybe that's a little optimistic though. And here we are. It's time to figure out when Terraria will actually die, but to do this, we have to define what a dead game is first, because for some reason I didn't do this earlier in the video. For simplicity's sake, we're just going to say that a dead game has 10% or less of their original audience still playing. And I understand that 10% of a fan base is still a lot, but it's pretty hard to find games similar to Terraria, let alone ones that are dead. If you want an actually legit method, go beg MattPat in the game theory comments. I'm very sure he'll see it. Now, I'm going to look at two different games that either have/had a similar player count to Terraria that are now in the 10% or less category. To figure out if a game is in the 10% or less category, I'm going to use Google Trends data because the only live player count option I have is Steam charts, and obviously there's more to gaming than just PC. The games I'm going to use are Grand Theft Auto 4 and Animal Crossing New Horizons. I understand that Animal Crossing New Horizons is a Nintendo Switch exclusive, but it still sold over 40 million copies, so I'm not too worried about it. I do want to clarify that these results aren't going to be completely accurate because, like I said, there's not really too many games like Terraria statistically. This game is a solo hit and was built from nothing but natural development, so it's hard to compare it to many games. Let's start with Grand Theft Auto 4. This game obviously reached its peak on release day and then kept a pretty impressive relevance up until Grand Theft Auto 5 got announced. Obviously, I can't predict how much longer it would have stayed relevant if GTA 5 hadn't happened, but the game actually didn't go below 10% until November 2013, so I'm going to say until then. Animal Crossing New Horizons had very similar statistics as well, besides the fact that it was released over a decade later. Although it did go under 10% a little over a year after release, I'm going to consider the second dip as the official 10% because that's when it stayed that way. These games obviously aren't crazy fair comparisons due to the fact that they had successful titles before them, but we can use this to our advantage later. Now, this clearly is not enough data for me to give a perfect estimate, but you guys have let me know that I am not a perfect YouTuber either, so I'm still going to try my best. If we look at Terraria's statistics, we see that it peaked on the release day of Journey's End, and it appears those new players are still remaining loyal. If we look back to July 2015, which was the previous massive rush of fans for 1.3, it seems like they started losing interest about 3 years after the update. And then obviously Terraria started getting more popularity on YouTube, and the hype came back, very similar to what happened to Minecraft in 2019. Now, if we considered 1.4.5 as Terraria's final update, which it obviously won't be, I'm going to guess the Terraria hype will start dying down fairly soon after that update. I mean, it clearly already is. So how long will it take Terraria to get to the 10% or less category? Well, it depends on how the future plays out. If Relogic decides to make Terraria 2, things could go a lot differently than if they just stopped updating Terraria. If Terraria 2 happens to be a major success, even bigger than the original, using the data from GTA 4 and Animal Crossing New Horizons as a reference, I'm guessing that the game will take at least 4 years to fade into somewhat obscurity. So if Terraria 2 was to release today, around 2027 to 2030. But if Terraria simply stopped getting updates, we already saw that with 1.3, in around 3 years, Terraria almost made it to the 10% or less category. Now, considering that Terraria has around a 2 times bigger fan base now compared to when 1.3 released, I'm going to multiply the estimate by 2, similar to how big the fan base has gotten. Considering all of that, it seems like Terraria would take around 8 to 10 years to fade into somewhat obscurity. Let me clarify again that this was probably not the most accurate way to get this result, but hey, at least we got a result in the end. Anyways, later.
My money when I'm in need. I gotta leave. I gotta